The autumn breeze carried the scent of pine and recent rain as Special Agent Lee stepped out of his government-issued black SUV. His polished shoes crunched against the gravel parking lot of the Pine Grove Police Department, a weathered brick building that had seen better days. The small southern town's main street stretched before him, lined with mom and pop stores and the kind of local diners where everyone knew each other's coffee orders by heart. Lee adjusted his navy blue tie and took a deep breath. After 15 years with the FBI's Civil Rights Division, he'd learned to trust his instincts. Something about this town's arrest statistics had caught his attention during a routine review. Numbers that didn't add up, patterns that raised red flags. The data showed that minority drivers were being pulled over at rates far higher than the local demographics could explain. Inside the police station, the air conditioning hummed against the late September heat. A desk sergeant looked up from his computer, his expression shifting from boredom to curiosity as he noticed Lee's crisp suit and FBI credentials. "Morning," Lee said, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had become his trademark. "I'm here to see the chief." The sergeant's radio crackled with routine patrol chatter as he made a phone call. Lee's trained eye took in every detail of the station, the outdated wanted posters, the coffee-stained duty roster, and most tellingly, the wall of officer photos that showed a department stuck in the past. In the chief's office, Lee sat straight-backed in a worn leather chair, laying out the purpose of his visit. "We've noticed some concerning patterns in your department's arrest records," he explained, sliding a folder across the desk. "I'll be conducting a thorough review of your operations." The chief, a heavy-set man with graying temples, leaned back in his chair. His leather holster creaked as he crossed his arms. "With all due respect, Agent," he drawled, "we run a tight ship here. Been doing things our way for a long time." Lee had heard this response before in other small towns across the country. He kept his face neutral as he opened his laptop, pulling up a series of graphs and charts. "Sometimes the old ways need updating, Chief," he replied evenly. "These numbers tell a story that needs attention." As Lee set up his temporary office in a corner of the records room, he could feel the ripple of unease spreading through the department. Officers passed by, some nodding politely, others barely concealing their resentment at this federal intrusion. That afternoon, Lee sat reviewing body camera footage, his notepad filling with observations. A young officer brought him coffee, a small gesture that spoke volumes about the divide already forming in the department. Some welcomed the chance for change, while others clung to their entrenched ways. The footage showed a disturbing pattern. Routine traffic stops turning hostile, minor infractions escalating unnecessarily, and a clear bias in who was being targeted. One officer in particular caught Lee's attention. Officer Richards, whose aggressive approach and questionable tactics appeared in video after video. As the sun set, casting long shadows through the records room windows, Lee made his final notes of the day. He'd seen enough to know this investigation would be more than just a routine review. This quiet town was hiding deep-rooted problems that needed to be addressed. Walking to his car that evening, Lee noticed Officer Richards watching him from the parking lot, standing next to his patrol car with an unreadable expression. Their eyes met briefly across the lot, and in that moment, Lee knew he found the thread that would unravel this department's troubled tapestry. Back in his hotel room, Lee called his supervisor in Washington. "We're going to need more time here," he said, looking out the window at the small town's main street, now quiet in the gathering dusk. "There's something here that needs to be fixed." He paused, watching a patrol car cruise slowly past his window. "And I think some people aren't going to like what we find." The next morning, Agent Lee arrived early at the police station, armed with fresh coffee and determination. The records room had become his temporary home, its walls lined with filing cabinets that held years of patrol reports, traffic citations, and complaint files. Outside, the town was just waking up, morning sunlight streaming through dusty blinds. As he reviewed more body camera footage, a pattern emerged that made his stomach tighten. Officer Richards appeared in many of the most troubling incidents. The veteran cop's behavior showed a clear shift whenever he dealt with minority citizens. His tone would become harsh, his questions more aggressive, and his patience non-existent. "Excuse me, Agent Lee." A soft knock interrupted his concentration. A young officer stood in the doorway, nervously adjusting her badge. "I think there's something you should see." She placed a worn manila folder on his desk, quickly glancing over her shoulder before speaking in a hushed tone. "These are unofficial complaint reports. They never made it to Internal Affairs." Lee opened the folder, finding handwritten statements from citizens whose voices had been silenced. Each page told a similar story: traffic stops gone wrong, searches without cause, and most disturbing of all, evidence that seemed to appear out of nowhere during these encounters. During lunch at the local diner, Lee noticed how conversations would pause when he walked by, only to resume in whispers. He chose a corner booth, spreading out his notes while picking at a turkey sandwich. The waitress, an elderly woman with kind eyes, refilled his coffee cup. "You know," she said quietly, "my grandson had a run-in with Officer Richards last month. Good kid, honor student. Still got roughed up pretty bad during a simple traffic stop." Back at the station, Lee spent hours cross-referencing arrest records with body camera timestamps. He discovered gaps in the footage, convenient equipment malfunctions during crucial moments. Officer Richards' record showed 20 years of service, but also a trail of dismissed complaints that had been buried in bureaucratic paperwork. A breakthrough came when Lee interviewed a former dispatcher who had recently retired. "It wasn't just random," she explained, her hands shaking as she sipped her tea. "Richards had a system. He knew which shifts had the least supervision, which streets had broken cameras. He even kept a list of judges who wouldn't look too closely at warrant applications." As evening approached, Lee received an unexpected visitor, a middle school teacher who had witnessed one of Richard's traffic stops. "I saw him drop something in that young man's car," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I wanted to speak up then, but—" She trailed off, years of fear evident in her eyes. Lee worked late into the night, piecing together evidence like a complex puzzle. The pattern was clear now. Richards had been systematically targeting minority citizens, using his badge as a weapon rather than a symbol of protection. Worse still, his influence had spread through the department like a poison, teaching younger officers that his methods were acceptable. Just before midnight, as Lee was preparing to leave, his phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Loading dock, 5 minutes." Cautiously making his way to the back of the station, he found a young patrol officer waiting in the shadows. "Richards isn't working alone," the officer whispered. "There's a whole network. They call themselves the Old Guard. They've been running things their way for years." Driving back to his hotel, Lee noticed a patrol car following him. Officer Richards himself, maintaining a careful distance. The message was clear. He was being watched. But as Lee reviewed his notes that night, spread across his hotel bed, he knew he was close to exposing something bigger than one corrupt officer. His phone lit up with a message from his FBI supervisor. "How deep does it go?" Lee looked at the stack of evidence he'd gathered, then at the dark window where he could still see the reflection of Richard's patrol car parked across the street. "All the way to the top," he texted back. "But I can prove it." The morning air was thick with tension as Agent Lee climbed into Officer Richards' patrol car for their scheduled ride along. The radio crackled with routine calls, while Richards adjusted his rearview mirror, his knuckles white against the steering wheel. Lee could feel the veteran officer's resentment radiating through the cramped space. "So, you're here to teach us how to do our jobs." Richards broke the silence, his tone carrying years of defensive pride. Lee kept his voice neutral, professional. "I'm here to observe, that's all." He noticed how Richard's jaw clenched at his response. They cruised through quiet residential streets, past neat lawns and children waiting for school buses. Everything seemed routine until Richard suddenly straightened in his seat. "Watch this," he muttered, flipping on his lights. Ahead, a well-maintained sit-in was following all traffic laws, driven by a young man in medical scrubs. Lee watched intently as Richards approached the car, his hand resting unnecessarily on his weapon. The young driver's hands were visible on the steering wheel, his hospital ID badge catching the morning sun. "License and registration," Richards barked, his entire demeanor shifting to aggressive authority. The driver remained remarkably composed, carefully reaching for his documents. "I'm actually heading to my shift at the hospital, officer," he explained calmly. "Is there a problem?" Richards ignored the question, snatching the papers roughly. "Step out of the vehicle." Lee's trained eye caught the subtle movement, Richards' hand slipping into his pocket as he circled the car. The morning sun glinted off something small being pawned. Years of FBI training kicked in, and Lee knew he couldn't let this continue. "Officer Richards," Lee's voice cut through the tension like a knife. "Step away from the vehicle." He held up his FBI credentials, stepping between Richards and the young driver. Richards froze, his face flushing with anger and surprise. "You're interfering with police business," Richards snarled, but Lee stood his ground. "No, I'm preventing a federal crime." He turned to the driver. "Sir, you're free to go. We'll be in touch if we need any additional information." The young man nodded gratefully, his hands still steady as he carefully returned to his car and drove away. Once he was gone, Richards turned on Lee, years of unchecked authority boiling over. "You have no idea how things work here," he spat. "People like you come in, thinking you understand our town." "People like me." Lee's voice remained calm, but carried steel beneath it. "Tell me, Officer Richards, what exactly do you mean by that?" The challenge hung in the air between them. Richards stepped closer, his face red with fury. "You know exactly what I mean. You outsiders, with your fancy badges and your big ideas about change. This is our town. We keep it safe our way." "Safe for who?" Lee countered, standing his ground. "I've seen your records, Richards. I've watched your body cam footage. I've talked to your victims. This isn't about safety. It's about power and prejudice. You don't know anything." Richards shouted, but his voice cracked slightly. Other patrol cars were starting to circle, drawn by the confrontation. Lee noticed younger officers watching from their vehicles, some with phones discreetly recording. "I know you were about to plant evidence on an innocent man," Lee said quietly. "I know about the complaints that disappeared. I know about the old guard and your special list of judges. The question is, how many of your fellow officers are tired of covering for you?" Richards glanced around, suddenly aware of their audience. His hand trembled slightly as he reached for his radio. "Dispatch, 10 to 19, returning to station." He turned to Lee, his voice low and threatening. "This isn't over." "You're right about that," Lee agreed, pulling out his phone. "In fact, it's just beginning." He played a video clip, Richards' own body camera footage showing multiple instances of misconduct. "The FBI has everything, Richards. Every traffic stop, every mysterious evidence discovery, every racist comment. Your old way of doing things ends today." They drove back to the station in rigid silence, the patrol car heavy with the weight of what had just happened. As they pulled into the parking lot, Lee noticed the station chief watching from his office window, phone pressed to his ear. The young officers who had witnessed the confrontation were already gathered near the entrance, whispering among themselves. "The world is changing, Officer Richards," Lee said as they exited the car. "The question is, are you going to change with it, or go down defending a broken system?" Word spread through the department like wildfire. By the next morning, battle lines had been drawn. Officer Richards sat in the break room, surrounded by his loyal supporters, mostly older officers who'd been with the force for decades. Their angry voices carried down the hallway to where Agent Lee worked in his temporary office. "He's making us look like criminals," one veteran officer complained loudly enough for everyone to hear. We've kept this town safe for 20 years, and now some outsider wants to tear it all down. The clink of coffee cups and murmurs of agreement followed. Lee noticed how the younger officers kept their distance from Richard's group, gathering instead near the dispatch desk. Their whispered conversations stopped whenever older officers passed by, replaced by careful nods and meaningful glances. The police union representative arrived around noon, a sharp-suited man with a briefcase full of paperwork. "This is harassment," he declared, dropping a formal complaint on the chief's desk. "Agent Lee is creating a hostile work environment and interfering with established police procedures." But something unexpected was happening. A young officer knocked on Lee's door that afternoon, quietly closing it behind him. "There's more you need to know," he said, placing a USB drive on the desk. "Some of us, we've been keeping our own records. Things we saw but couldn't report before." The drive contained video clips, text messages, and photos. Evidence that painted a clear picture of systemic discrimination. More officers began coming forward, at first just one or two, then small groups. They shared stories of being pressured to follow Richard's special procedures during traffic stops, of being told which neighborhoods to target. "I didn't become a cop for this," a female officer told Lee, her voice steady, but her hands shaking as she handed over her written statement. "My grandmother marched for civil rights. What would she think if she knew what I've been part of?" Richards and his supporters didn't take this rebellion lying down. Anonymous complaints about the younger officers started appearing in personnel files. Shift schedules were suddenly rearranged, putting whistleblowers on the worst assignments. The message was clear: stay in line or pay the price. The town's police union called an emergency meeting that evening. Lee watched from his car as officers filed into the community center. Through the windows, he could see Richards gesturing angrily at the front of the room, pointing fingers and pounding his fist on the podium. But the tide was turning. Half the officers walked out of that meeting, led by a veteran sergeant who'd finally had enough. "My grandfather was a cop in this town," he told the gathered crowd in the parking lot. "He taught me that a badge means protecting everyone, not just the people who look like us." Later that night, Lee received an unexpected visitor at his hotel, the police chief himself. The older man looked tired, the weight of 2 decades of looking the other way visible in his slumped shoulders. "You have to understand," the chief said, staring into his untouched coffee. "It didn't happen overnight. Little things, year after year. We told ourselves we were just being thorough, just keeping the peace." He paused, his voice heavy with regret. "But that's not what we were doing, was it?" Meanwhile, Richards wasn't going quietly. Local business owners reported pressure from his supporters to sign a petition demanding Lee's removal. Longtime residents who'd spoken to the FBI found their cars ticketed repeatedly. But for every act of intimidation, there was a counterbalance. Young officers stepping up to protect witnesses, community members bringing coffee and food to the station for those who'd chosen to stand against the old system. The next morning, Lee arrived at the station to find something had changed. The wall of officer photos, once a testament to the department's resistance to change, had been taken down. In its place hung a single frame containing the oath of office all police officers take, its words about protecting and serving all citizens equally standing as a silent rebuke to those who'd forgotten its meaning. "It's not over," the young officer who'd first brought him evidence said, joining Lee in looking at the wall. "Richard still has friends in high places. But at least now, we're not pretending anymore. At least now, we're fighting back." A breakthrough came on a rainy Tuesday morning. Agent Lee sat in his office, surrounded by stacks of old case files, when a retired court clerk appeared at his door. Her hands trembled as she placed a worn notebook on his desk. "I kept my own records," she whispered. "Things that didn't seem right in Richard's arrest reports." The notebook was a goldmine. For years, this quiet clerk had documented discrepancies. Dates that didn't match, evidence that appeared impossibly fast, witnesses whose names never made it to official reports. But more disturbing were the patterns she'd noticed in Richard's training methods. Lee spent hours cross-referencing her notes with department records. The picture that emerged was chilling. Richards hadn't just been acting alone. He'd created a systematic approach to targeting minority citizens and had trained a generation of officers in his methods. "Watch how I handle this," Richards would tell new officers during ride-alongs. "Sometimes you need to help the evidence along." His techniques spread through the department like a virus, passed from veteran to rookie, justified as real police work rather than the discrimination it truly was. The next revelation came from an unexpected source: the department's computer technician. "I was backing up old hard drives," he explained, showing Lee a folder of archived emails. "Look at the dates. Every time there was a complaint against Richards, these same judges and prosecutors would get messages from him." The emails revealed a network of influence stretching back years. Richards had cultivated relationships with certain officials who shared his views, ensuring his cases would land on sympathetic desks. Cases against minority defendants would be pushed through quickly, while complaints about officer conduct mysteriously disappeared. A young officer who'd recently transferred from another district brought forward more evidence. "It's not just here," she explained. Richards used to give presentations at police conferences. He called it proactive policing, but it was really about teaching others his profiling techniques. Lee found recordings of these presentations, carefully labeled as community safety workshops. The coded language was clear to anyone who knew what to look for. Suggestions about which neighborhoods needed extra attention, which drivers were statistically more likely to be carrying contraband. The investigation led to the property room, where an observant clerk had noticed patterns in evidence handling. "Certain officers always seemed to find drugs during their traffic stops," she explained. "Always the same amount, always packaged the same way. It was too perfect." Inventory records showed discrepancies, small amounts of confiscated drugs disappearing, then mysteriously reappearing in new cases. The same serial numbers appearing on currency listed as evidence in multiple arrests. It was systematic, calculated, and had gone unchallenged for years. Late one evening, as Lee reviewed security footage from the station's parking lot, he noticed something strange. Richards and several other officers would meet regularly at shift changes, always in the same corner of the lot. Their conversations looked casual, but the pattern was suspicious. A lip reader from the FBI's technical unit confirmed what these conversations were about: coordinating which areas to target, sharing information about which judges were on duty, warning each other about troublemakers who might complain about police conduct. The final piece fell into place when a senior dispatcher came forward. She'd kept a private log of radio traffic, noting how certain officers would call in suspicious vehicles without cause, creating pretexts for traffic stops. The timing always coincided with minority citizens driving through predominantly white neighborhoods. "I couldn't sleep at night," she admitted, pushing her logbook across the desk. "I kept thinking about my own grandchildren. What kind of world are we leaving them if we let this continue?" As Lee organized the evidence, the full scope of Richard's influence became clear. This wasn't just about one corrupt officer. It was about a system that had been carefully built and maintained over decades. A system designed to appear legitimate while perpetuating old prejudices under the cover of law enforcement. The young officers who'd come forward watched anxiously as Lee prepared his report. "What happens now?" one asked, voicing the question on everyone's mind. Lee looked up from his desk, where photos of officers, timelines, and connection diagrams covered every surface. "Now," he said quietly, "we make sure everyone sees the truth. Not just about Richards, but about how easily good people can be led down the wrong path when they stop questioning what they're told is right." The morning of the departmental hearing arrived with an atmosphere of electric tension. The community center's main hall had been transformed into a makeshift courtroom, packed with officers, town officials, and concerned citizens. Agent Lee stood at the front, his evidence carefully organized in folders before him. Officer Richards sat with his supporters, his usual confidence noticeably shaken. The polished badge on his chest seemed to mock the very principles it represented. His eyes darted between faces in the crowd, searching for allies among the sea of stern expressions. The police chief called the hearing to order, his voice carrying the weight of what was to come. "Today, we address serious allegations of misconduct within our department," he began. The rustling of papers and shifting of chairs gradually settled into tense silence. Lee stepped forward, his presentation methodical and devastating. Security footage played on the wall screen, showing Richard's traffic stops in stark detail. The officer's face grew paler with each damning clip. Audio recordings of his training sessions filled the room, his own words now testifying against him. "These aren't isolated incidents," Lee explained, displaying charts of arrest statistics. "This is a pattern spanning 2 decades. A systematic approach to discrimination taught to new officers as standard procedure." He laid out the evidence piece by piece. The manipulated evidence logs, the suspicious timing of drug discoveries, the network of coordinated harassment. Richard's lawyer tried to interrupt, claiming the evidence was circumstantial, but Lee was prepared. "Let's hear from those directly affected," he suggested, gesturing to the back of the room. A middle-aged man in military dress blues stood up, medals gleaming on his chest. The veteran's voice was steady as he described being pulled over 6 times in 1 month, each time by Richards or his trainees. "I served this country for 20 years, he said, his words cutting through the silence. "Fought in 2 wars. Then I come home and get treated like a criminal in my own town because of how I look." Richards shifted uncomfortably in his seat as more witnesses came forward. The medical student he tried to frame spoke about the impact on his career. A grandmother described how her grandchildren were now afraid of police cars. A young officer detailed the pressure to adopt Richard's discriminatory practices. The evidence kept mounting. The retired court clerk's notebook, the dispatcher's private logs, the computer technician's archived emails. Each new revelation pushed Richards further into a corner, his decades of carefully constructed authority crumbling before everyone's eyes. When it was Richard's turn to speak, his arrogance finally cracked. "I was just doing my job," he insisted, his voice rising defensively. "Keeping the peace, maintaining order. Someone had to do it." His fist slammed the table, making his water glass jump. The outburst hung in the air, revealing the true face behind his professional mask. Lee calmly played one final piece of evidence. Richard's own body camera footage from a recent traffic stop, showing him planting evidence in a citizen's car. The room erupted in murmurs of disgust. Several of Richard's former supporters stood up and walked out, unable to defend his actions any longer. The veteran officer who testified earlier stood again, this time addressing Richards directly. "You didn't protect the peace," he said quietly. "You broke it. Every time you abused your power, every rookie you taught to hate, every citizen whose trust you destroyed. You weren't serving justice. You were betraying it." The hearing lasted into the evening. One by one, the charges were laid out. Evidence tampering, civil rights violations, abuse of power, conspiracy to obstruct justice. Richards watched his career, his reputation, his whole system of beliefs collapse around him. As the chief announced the decision to terminate Richards and launch criminal investigations, Lee noticed the younger officers exchanging glances of relief and determination. The old guard's power was broken, but the real work of rebuilding trust was just beginning. Outside, the setting sun cast long shadows across the parking lot. Community members gathered in small groups, discussing what they'd witnessed. A young officer approached Lee, badge gleaming in the fading light. "Thank you," she said simply, "for showing us that doing the right thing still matters." Lee nodded, watching as Richards was escorted to his car, no longer wearing the badge he'd dishonored. "The law applies to everyone," he replied, "even those sworn to uphold it." maybe especially those. 6 months had passed when Agent Lee's car pulled back into Pine Grove. The autumn leaves had given way to spring blossoms, and the first thing he noticed was the new flag flying outside the police station, a community unity banner designed by local high school students. The changes inside were even more striking. The old wall officer photos had been replaced by a community board covered with pictures of police and citizens working together, cleanup projects, youth programs, neighborhood meetings. The stale coffee and tension in the air had been replaced by something fresher, more hopeful. The young officer who'd first brought him evidence of Richard's misconduct was now wearing sergeant's stripes. She greeted Lee with a warm handshake. "You should see what we've done," she said, leading him through the station. The break room, once divided by invisible lines of loyalty, now hosted regular community meetings. "We started a mentorship program," she explained, showing him photos of officers coaching youth sports teams. "Some of these kids used to run away when they saw a police car. Now they wave us down to show off their basketball moves." Her pride was evident in every word. The dispatch center had been modernized, with new systems designed to ensure accountability. Every traffic stop was now recorded and reviewed, not to catch officers doing wrong, but to help them do right. "We learn from each other," the dispatcher explained. "When someone handles a situation really well, we share it as an example." In the chief's office, now occupied by a respected community leader who'd spent 30 years building bridges between neighborhoods, Lee reviewed the department's new statistics. Traffic stops were down, but successful crime prevention was up. Complaints had dropped dramatically, while officer commendations had increased. "The real change is in how we measure success," the new chief explained. "It's not about the number of arrests anymore. It's about building trust, solving problems before they become crimes." He showed Lee letters from community members, thanking officers for their help and professionalism. Outside, Lee joined a foot patrol, walking with 2 officers through neighborhoods that had once been targets of Richard's discriminatory practices. Children played freely in their front yards, elderly residents sat on porches greeting officers by name, and there was a palpable sense of peace. "Remember that medical student Richards tried to frame?" one officer asked. "He's doing his residency at the local hospital now. Comes by sometimes to teach us about handling medical emergencies we might encounter on patrol." The story was a powerful symbol of how bridges could be rebuilt. At the community center, Lee attended a graduation ceremony for the department's new training program. Officers from neighboring towns had come to learn Pine Grove's new approach to community policing. The curriculum, developed with input from civil rights leaders and local citizens, focused on understanding, communication, and equal justice. The veteran who testified against Richards was there too, now serving on the Civilian Oversight Board. "We don't forget what happened," he told Lee, "but we use it to remind ourselves why change was necessary. Every new officer hears the story, not to shame anyone, but to show them a better way." Later that afternoon, Lee visited the local high school where officers now regularly had lunch with students, breaking down barriers that had existed for generations. The school principal shared stories of how relationships had improved, how students now saw officers as mentors and protectors rather than threats. As the day drew to a close, Lee stood in the police station parking lot with the new chief and several officers. The setting sun painted the sky in shades of hope, and the evening shift was arriving. A diverse group of faces that better reflected the community they served. "You know what the best part is?" the young sergeant said, watching a rookie officer help an elderly woman with her groceries across the street. "It feels natural now. We're not trying to prove anything anymore. We're just being the police force this town always deserved." Lee thought about the notebook in his briefcase, filled with similar success stories from other departments who learned from Pine Grove's example. Real change was possible. It wasn't always easy, and it didn't happen overnight. But when good people stood up for what was right, transformation could take root and grow. As he drove out of town, Lee caught sight of his reflection in the rearview mirror and smiled. The old guard's prediction had come true, but not in the way they'd expected. Pine Grove had indeed been changed forever, not by destruction, but by renewal. Not by force, but by justice. Not by fear, but by hope.